Welcome everyone to Virtual Insights, Francesc Tosquelles, Avant-Garde Psychiatry and the Birth of Art Brut. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Mathilde Walker-Bio, Curator of Programming at the American Folk Art Museum. A quick note that closed captioning in English is available today by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. I'm joining you today from Queens, New York. And before we begin, I want to acknowledge that our museum stands upon Lenape-Hawking, the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape Delaware peoples. We honor Lenape peoples, past, present, and future, and are committed to centering Indigenous perspectives in exhibitions and programs at the museum. As many of you know, AFAM is dedicated to the work of self-taught artists across time and place. Next slide, please. And we are thrilled to offer a new perspective on the intersections of art and psychiatry with the exhibition Francesc Tosquelles, Avant-Garde Psychiatry and the Birth of Art Brut. Now on view at Lincoln Square until August 18, along with a concurrent exhibition Somewhere to Roost. This exhibition explores for the first time in the United States the legacy of Francesc Tosquelles, a Catalan psychiatrist who pioneered radical psychiatric practices that came to be known as institutional psychotherapy. An extraordinary variety of materials, including archival documents, videos, and rarely seen artworks, introduces us to Tosquelles' time at the Saint-Alban Psychiatric Hospital in southern France from 1940 to the early 1960s. The exhibition presents a complex and rich history of this institution as a refuge for political dissidents, artists, and intellectuals during World War II, as an asylum village where patients, medical staff, on-site workers, and neighboring rural communities interacted in a non-hierarchical way until the early 1960s, and as a creative environment for patients such as Auguste Forestier and Marguerite Sirvin, whose artistic endeavors impacted French artist Jean Dubuffet and his conceptualization of art brut in the post-war period. In light of this rich legacy, the exhibition also examines mental health history in the United States through the works of American artists such as Martin Ramirez and Judith Scott. So today I'm very pleased to be joined by the curators of this fantastic exhibition, Joana Masó, a literary critic, a senior lecturer and a researcher at the Research Center for Theory, Gender and Sexuality, and the UNESCO Chair, Women, Development and Cultures at the University of Barcelona in Spain. Carles Guerra, an artist, art critic and independent curator, associate professor at the Department of Audiovisual Communication at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona, Spain. Valérie Rousseau, curatorial chair for exhibitions and senior curator at AFAM. Edouard Diogarty, Anthony Petullo Foundation, and Weiler, curatorial fellow at AFAM. So today the curators will walk us through the exhibition and invite us to reconsider the history of psychiatry and its connections to art, literature, and French theory through the exhibition's various material and objects. This curatorial walkthrough will last for about an hour. There will be time for Q&A, so please share your question with us throughout the talk using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. I'll be also using the chat room to share more details about the program, the speakers. So please, if you need anything, you can drop me a line in the chat. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague Valérie Rousseau, who will be leading the presentation. I just want to say that the program is being recorded and will be made available online in the coming weeks. We are grateful for opportunities like this one, like this program, to connect online, which will not be possible without you. I hope you'll consider supporting our programs through a donation to the museum. Following this conversation, your support has great impact and makes a difference in our ability to champion the work of self-taught artists. And now I'll hand it over to Valérie. Please welcome her and all our guests. Thank you.
Thank you, Mathilde. Do you hear me well?
Yes, very well.
Good. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm very pleased to be able today to share with you and my colleagues the content of this exhibition, which was a long journey. I wanted to mention first that this exhibition uncovers scholarship developed over the last 8 years, maybe 9 years, first initiated by my co-curators, Joana, Masó, and Guerra, and then adapted for our American audiences during the last few years by myself and Eduardo Gardi. This adaptation prompted us to add a US section in the exhibition, which includes artists based on turning points for mental health systems in the US. And we try to place these turning points, these moments in dialogue with Tosquelles' initiatives. The exhibition was co-organized by CCCB, the Contemporary Cultural Center of Barcelona. This is a 4-venue collaboration, and the last one that resulted in a previous exhibition at CCCB in Barcelona, at Les Abattoirs de Toulouse, and at the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid. The exhibition is composed of about 250 objects. The other venues display a much larger amount of objects. I heard from CCCB it was about 750 objects and archival documents. In this exhibition at AFAM, we are displaying the works by patient artists active during Tosquelles' activity. The most important ensembles are the ones of Auguste Forestier and Marguerite Servin. We have artworks by professional artists associated to the avant-garde, like Jean Dubuffet, Antonin Artaud, Gérard Vulliamy, and Jacques Matarasso, among others. We have also included moving images, and I think it's a very dynamic and important component of the exhibition. So we have documentary films, never seen footages retrieved by Tosquelles and his peers on the site of the Saint-Alban Psychiatric Hospital, and as well other documents related to the US section of the exhibition. So without further delay, here is a beautiful boat created by Auguste Forestier, which is on similar to the one on the image here, where you see Tosquelles raising that sculpture while he is on the rooftop of one of the buildings of Saint-Alban. So without further any delay, I would like to ask Joana to situate Tosquelles within a historical and political context, maybe come back on his training, his militancy, and how this very context was formative for his innovative psychiatric practices to come. Joana?
Thank you very, very much, Valérie, for your questions. I am very, very happy to have this public conversation this evening with you, with Carlos, and also with Edward. Thank you very much for this invitation. So Tosquelles began to work as a psychiatrist during the 30s in Catalonia, and he would refer to Barcelona during those years as a little Vienna, since he learned a lot from German, Hungarian, and Czech Jewish psychiatrists who had landed in Barcelona coming from Sigmund Freud's circle in Vienna. So Tosquelles soon understood that psychiatry, traditionally related to neurology, needed now, at the beginning of the 20th century, to be anchored in psychoanalysis. And Tosquelles combined this renewed approach to psychiatry with the occupational therapy, the therapy through the work, developed by the German psychiatrist Hermann Siemens, in order to organize a new economy of the hospital with cooperatives of self-managed work by the patients themselves, with the help of the doctors and the nurses. So patients could earn money by working, and they could invest it in different activities within the hospital, such as theater in Catalonia during the 30s, or cinema in France in the 50s. So this transformation of the psychiatric institutions was a political one, and it was shaped by Tosquelles' activism in radical politics in Catalonia, and by his experience also a little bit later during the Spanish Civil War. Since he was a militant at the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, a communist and anti-Stalinist party, in a context in which Catalan psychiatrists were strongly politicized because the Catalan Republic proposed a new network of mental health care services that would be decentralized and cover the entire territory in order to avoid separating patients from their families and from social ties. That's the reason why the exhibition presents Tosquelles' therapeutic work as a collective experience. Tosquelles' project was first and foremost part of the Catalan Republic's project that considered hospitals as ill places or ill institutions, reducing patients to isolation and inactivity. So it was within this political context, within this political project, that Tosquelles began to conceive the hospital as a real asylum, as a sort of shelter, protecting patients from the violence, what he called the violence of society against madness.
If we move forward a few years after during the Spanish Civil War, can you give us a better context of his exile to France and therefore the beginning of these years where he when he was imprisoned in a concentration camp, of the unique approach he had to the healing of people in the camp, but also in general, the healing of people with mental illness?
Yes, maybe if we began a little bit earlier, before his arrival to France during the Spanish Civil War from 36 to 39, Tosquelles first directed the psychiatric services of the Republican Army against Franco, the dictator, in different regions in Spain. But then, during the Spanish Civil War, he rarely healed the patients themselves. Tosquelles mostly treated the therapeutic community, which meant that he took care of the doctors and the nurses who were themselves in contact with ill soldiers or ill people. So in a certain sense, he resolved to treat the normal pathologies or the normal anxieties of doctors rather than the patients themselves. So this was a pioneering practice, since the concept of therapeutic community was formally invented years later in the 40s by English psychiatrists Thomas Maine and Maxwell Jones, who coined the term therapeutic community to give a name to this coexistence or this cohabitation between the medical profession and the patients within new common and shared spaces. So for me, the important thing was that this approach was residential, with patients and therapists living together. And this conception implied that the responsibility for treatment was not confined to the trained medical staff only, but it was a concern also of the whole community members, like patients themselves. So when Tosquelles arrived in exile to France in 1939, after the fascists won the war, he continued to be inspired by the practice of the therapeutic communities within the concentration camp, as you say, Valérie, in the south of France, in Sept-Fonds, where he lived for 4 months, working with people who have not been trained as psychiatrists. He created a sort of psychiatric unit or service in collaboration with writers and musicians. Finally, when he arrived to the Saint-Alban hospital in January 1940, where he worked for more than 2 decades, the Tosquelles Hospital continued to develop this interrelationship with all the people who were working at the hospital, but mostly with the idea of the milieu, with the situated environment. So in those years, Tosquelles coined the term of geopsychiatry, so as to name this locally situated psychiatry in the territory, which was the basis of all his practice.
And Joana, can you give like a brief definition of what we understand by institutional psychotherapy, maybe in relationship to this beautiful title that you use for your anthology of Tosquelles writing, Curing the Institution. So this criticism of the mental institution itself and its structure.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this term, institutional psychotherapy, was first coined by French psychiatrists Georges de Maison and Philippe Cogelin in order to name different experiences conducted in French hospitals during the 40s, like Saint-Alban, having developed a conception of the asylum as what they called a living being, homogeneous with society, so a sort of living place capable to recreate society in a sense, enabling what they called the profound awakening of the patient's non-alienated capacities, patient's social performance, social relationships, patient's responsibility, and the most important word is the patient's dignity. So the specific way in which Tosquelles developed this collective institutional psychotherapy implied also that everyone working at the hospital, from the doctors to patients, were at the same time patients and carers. We can say caregivers and care receivers, soignants and soignés, and saying that the doctors were also care receivers was, of course, a way of deconstructing the historical authority of the figure of the psychiatrist. Another very important Tosquelles early insights in those years during the 40s, and a still very important one for us today, I think, was to denounce psychiatrists' fear of madness. Tosquelles thought that psychiatrists were profoundly afraid of the mentally ill patients, which historically led to impeding patients' freedom of movement through restrained chairs and beds, straitjackets, and seclusion rooms. And far from classical psychiatry, Tosquelles removed the window bars and the balcony barrettes of the hospital in Saint-Alban during the 50s. He opened the hospital so as the patients could interact with the villagers and the farmers, and he advocated for what he called the patient's right to roam or the right of vagrancy. Moreover, Tosquelles' idea was that people who haven't been trained as psychiatrists haven't yet developed such fear of madness or such fear of illness. That's the reason why he worked with people. He wanted to work with people outside the medical profession. He was happy collaborating with musicians, with writers and lawyers, and even nuns and sex workers. So I do think that we have still a psychiatry which fears madness, and more generally a medicine which fears illness and suffering, trying to put them at a distance. So the Tosquelles legacy, based on socializing, on both depathologizing and generalizing in a certain way madness, is still ours, and I think that we still need it.
Thank you, Joana. So you mentioned that Tosquelles arrived at Saint-Alban in early 1940, in January 1940. He was recruited from the Setfond concentration camp to Saint-Alban for his psychiatric expertise that was already known. Upon his arrival, he was impacted by the Nazi collaborating French Vichy government's soft extermination policy, which eliminated basic resources for psychiatric populations whom the regime deemed undesirable, and would end up killing 40,000 people by the end of the war. Saint-Alban had a population of about 850 patients at the time, facing a state of emergency. And there, Tosquelles oversaw a radical transformation of Saint-Alban. Here you have an overview of the Saint-Alban psychiatric facility, situated at 4,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by farmlands and a small local population. So at the height of the Nazi repression in occupied France, Saint-Alban opened its door also to hide persecuted intellectuals, Jews, and active members of the resistance. So this very notion of the asylum as a refuge, a sanctuary, was very at the core of this, of the terminology here. Carles, I would like to ask you to discuss further the dynamics on site, on the site of the psychiatric hospital, with the outsiders to the hospital life, who quickly blended into the hospital community and came across the artworks and writings of its patient. Oh, Carles, you are muted.
I was saying hi, everybody, and happy to be here explaining some details about this presentation in New York. Yeah, indeed, the 1940s, the early 1940s, it's kind of a high moment in the Saint-Alban's experience, yet it is a moment of shortage of food. It is a moment of a political disease because the Nazis are just around the hospital. Saint-Alban was right on the border in between occupied France and the free France. So the hospital played an important role in hosting political refugees, some very distinct, like Paul Eluard, Anouche, writer, poet, and other philosophers like Georges Canguilhem, who passed by, even though shortly, or other figures like Georges Sadoul, who also spent, short periods in the hospital, but also important doctors fleeing from Paris, from the city, and spending time in the hospital. So the place soon became a blend of intellectuals, political refugees, Jews, individual Jews escaping from Nazi persecution. So in a way, these people were not only offer a place to hide, but also a place to get in touch with madness, as Joana was saying before. In a way, we will see how these intellectuals are not just admiring these figures, but also living daily with them. Paul Eluard, remarkably, he wrote Souvenirs de la Maison des Fous, Souvenirs from the Madhouse, which was later on published in 1945. But it is a book in which he depicts, in which he offers several portraits of female women who were, allegedly mentally ill. And this is a book based on some sort of infatuation with the figures of mad women, as surrealists were often the case. Yet the interesting aspect here is not just that there are intellectuals working inside of the hospital next to these mentally ill people who are committed to the hospital, whether voluntarily or involuntarily. The idea is that the hospital generated this regime of what they like to call co-evilness. That is to say, practices that were often segregated because intellectual production is never imagined to take place within a madhouse, an asylum, psychiatric hospital was taking place there. Even Tristan Tzara will arrive at the hospital in the summer of 1945, right after the end of the Second World War, with his son, and also he himself wrote a beautiful poem, Parler Seul, again based on portraits of women, isolated women who were deemed to have no remedies in their life. A picture very much against the grain of what the institutional psychotherapy was offering to these patients, because institutional psychotherapy was basically offering a place to live, a decent place to live, to socialize through a multi-directional therapy. So it was based on the interaction of, based on whoever was living in the hospital. So co-evilness, I think it's a term that represents very well these complex regimes of intellectuals, doctors, patients, and as well the villagers who would sneak in the hospital at a certain moments. And this generated a wonderful ecosystem, which is a sort of a natural resource, natural environment for institutional psychotherapy.
And Carlos, if we make a pause and we look more concretely about the initiatives on site, the Tosquelles initiatives on site that materialize what we will call later institutional psychotherapy. Maybe here we have an image, an installation shot where we see footage by Tosquelles on the background, but also other activities in which patients were involved, taken care of, but also at the same time melted with the hospital staff during day trips. So if you can describe us a little bit more how it materialized on the side of the hospital, what kind of methods were at play?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, this is a brilliant moment in the exhibition, confronting Tosquelles films in the background, films that were roughly produced in the mid-50s and very soon circulated through different places to reveal what the practices were inside, in the confines of the psychiatric hospital of Saint-Alban. This is actually a film that originally bore the title Transformations in the Saint-Alban Hospital and was presented in Santan at the Congress in Barcelona in 1958. And then on the foreground, you will notice these kind of, extraordinary objects produced by Auguste Forestier, one of the most distinguished patients in the hospital, who also died around 1958. But in the long period of time he lived there, and this is a kind of a chronic condition many patients shared. This is one of the concerns of Tosquelles and his colleagues. I mean, how to break away, how to escape this chronic condition for patients. So this patient produce an enormous quantity of objects. And I like to say objects before saying artworks, because in the context of the hospital, these were objects that had an exchange value, a value that would be in as much considered because it was sold to the villagers as toys, as presents, or because it was traded or with other things. The interesting aspect is that this practice was never considered an artistic practice. It was part of the ergotherapy program at large in the hospital, including weaving baskets and many other sort of activities, as well as theater, cinema, keeping up with the canteen, and all these kind of domestic chores inside of the hospital. So we have different degrees of categorizing these practices, but most and foremost, the important sort of organization that made it possible, it was the Patients Club. Le Club Paul Balbé, named after after the director that was in place in the early 40s, Paul Balbé. So the club constituted an organization to give back to patients the autonomy they lost once committed with the hospital, to give them the financial autonomy, because they would be able to have an economy through these activities. They would be able to represent themselves in meetings, in reunions. And if you look at the programs of the Willy programs, it was crazy. I mean, they would have to attend many meetings. They would have their representatives. They were committed, and they were acquiring responsibility. That was also a word they would often repeat. They have to get back their responsibility, because when one gets committed to a hospital, one loses its condition as a citizen. So the club is in itself an overall creation, which I think it's very important. And for Tosquelles, it was based on his previous experiences in Catalonia in the 20s and the 30s, when most public services were not offered by the state, but they had to be provided by the self-organization of the civil society. So here we have extraordinary objects by Auguste Forestier, who will become very soon an emblem of Art Brut. Art Brut being a term coined by French artist Jean Dubuffet, starting in the mid-40s. Art Brut, however, is not a term consistent with the experiences of Saint-Alban. It is a term of an artist trying to sort of use these objects as example of a critique of the civilizational aspects of the post-war period in Europe. So we will have objects kind of migrating from inside the hospital, having a particular value, and going outside and having a cultural value. And this is a very contested sort of narrative nowadays, because because I mean, these are objects with multiple appreciations. As many, it depends on the institutions that sort of host them. They will receive one value or another. We see the same happening with Marguerite Servins, an extraordinary woman living there, also dying in the mid-50s, who was known for her embroideries depicting really weird scenes, sometimes localized within the confines of the same hospital she was living in. So these objects are nowadays presented or shown in Lausanne at the Musée de l'Art Brut, in Lille, another museum who has an important section on art brut, what we often call here outsider art. But the problem is that art brut became such a fashionable term that it sort of flattened every detail or genealogical perception of these objects.
Thank you, Carles. We will come back on this very question, very important question that you just posed. So concurrent to Tosquelles' aspiration to cure mental institutions, we expanded on Dubuffet's critique of the art institution and his conceptualization of Art Brut that is intrinsically connected to the Saint-Alban story, is well represented in the exhibition. So indeed, Dubuffet traveled to Saint-Alban in September 1945, the year he coined the term Art Brut, where he hoped at the time to acquire sculptures by one of its patients that we just viewed, Auguste Forestier. He had discovered Forestier's work in Paris the previous year at the house of Paul Éluard. Paul Éluard lived on the site of Saint-Alban in a refuge fashion during the 1943 and 44, brought back sculptures by Forestier in Paris, and share his collection and his works with his art community. And Dubuffet had seen these works at the house of Éluard and traveled to Saint-Alban. On his way to Saint-Alban, he stopped at the Rodez Psychiatric Hospital, where hospitalized Antonin Artaud, of which you have an oil on canvas by Jean Dubuffet here on the slide. During that same trip, though, he stopped there. And I just want to mention that in the exhibition, we tried to really gather objects created or in response to this very specific history of Saint-Alban. And Rodez been in the same geographical proximity of Saint-Alban, and help us to narrow the story to networks of doctors, but also of encounters in the same area, if you want. So Dubuffet confirmed this very year his interest to collect Art Brut, not anymore just to gather documentation on Art Brut. And we talk at the moment of a period in art history where from the early 20th century, different aesthetic models triggered a reassessment of artistic traditions and creative process, talking about the children's art, vernacular expressions, and works from non-Western cultures. Psychopathological art are all these terms associated to art what creates outside of the mainstream. I wanted to ask you, Carles, to go back on the ideas that you talked about further, about the idea of situating the project of Dubuffet within the larger context of the interest for the works produced in hospitals by individuals with mental illness.
Yeah, I mean, I said it is a very contested project nowadays because whereas it sort of revitalized a criticism against sort of hegemonic culture, and one has to acknowledge that what Dubuffet did was to sort of emulate his peer ethnographers in the late 20s, 30s in France, who instituted Musée de l'Homme by going to Africa and bring back ethnographic objects. So that what Dubuffet made was to do something similar, but within the confines of our allegedly West society. So he went to psychiatric hospitals searching for the authentic, for the true expression, for the less contaminated form of art. That's why he wrote letters. He published like a journal, and he was asking for all these items, objects from hospitals all over the world, demanding the doctors to send them samples, objects, photographs, and short stories about each of the patients. So this sort of enterprise, which has been very well received by the art world as some sort of fringe representation of what is allegedly normal in art, had like different responses. And Dubuffet was not the only one. But we had artists like Henri Michaud trying to recreate deep inside himself the experience of a psychotic crisis by using drugs, and having a doctor, another Spanish exilied psychiatrist, Julián de Guerra, by having him next to him, observing the effects of those drugs. So that madness, mental illness was not something just to be observed from afar, but also recreated and experience in one's own body as if it were a laboratory. This is what is called a psychomimetic experience. So we will see multiple cases, and not just Art Brut, dealing with this very production of mentally ill people. The interesting thing about the exhibition is that visitors will see works like this one, Eugène Didot, or many others, opening up the representations of the work produced inside of hospitals. And this is a strong phenomenon in the early 50s, up to the fact that the notion of a psychopathological art became extremely popular among psychiatrists, among doctors, as a sort of normal way of approaching these objects, revealing pathologies by different patients in different countries. In its own turn, this very particular approach impacted on artists like Artsger Jones, who roughly imitated the style of these exhibitions and these works. So we have a complex situation in the 50s by which whatever is produced in a very situated place, like Joana was saying, it becomes a model for many different bystanders.
Yeah, and I would like to ask Joana, in light of what you say, to reflect on this very idea that the works associated with both Dubuffet's expanded canon and Saint-Alban's exchange economy are featured in international exhibitions and museums collection and attract no shortage of buyers today on the art market. So questions persist about the conditions of production of these works in hospitals and their artistic status. So what is the nature of the tension between Tosquelles' and Dubuffet's respective positions, notably the question of the rightful ownership of the works produced by patients at Saint-Alban? As we mentioned earlier, some of the works circulated outside of Saint-Alban's wall. They were traded, they could have been gifted and donated by Forestier himself. So can you point out a few elements of this difference of vision between Tosquelles and Dubuffet?
Yes, thank you, Valérie. So in 1945, when Dubuffet coined, as you said, Valérie, the concept of art brut, and when he came to Saint-Alban in September 1945, Tosquelles refused to meet him, and Tosquelles refused that Dubuffet encounter patient Auguste Forestier, since Tosquelles wanted to protect certain patients. 2 decades later, in 1966, Dubuffet wrote a text on Auguste Forestier's artworks in which he described the context in which Forestier lived and died at Saint-Alban as, and I quote Dubuffet, as an oppressive seclusion, since his hospital, wrote Dubuffet, was like a desert island. So, of course, to speak of Saint-Alban like as a desert island is a historical and a political misunderstanding, is a profound disagreement between, on the one hand, Tosquelles' psychiatry that wanted to change real life, and on the other hand, Dubuffet's search for marginalized styles, for antisocial or anti-cultural gestures, very far from this collective emancipation, such as of Saint-Alban, since Dubuffet was not interested in acknowledging this psychiatric experimentation, which has introduced in Saint-Alban cultural practices at the heart of the therapeutic care, without naming them art brut. Nowadays, as you both said, Carlas and Valérie, in the 21st century, the history of art brut is also problematic, since cultural avant-gardes as surrealism with art brut inaugurated a very specific art market with important circulation of money and value in the European and American museums, from which people who create all these works of art, the patients themselves, were excluded from the beginning. Most of the time, the patients in the psychiatric hospitals didn't consent to this transformation, as Carla said, of their own works into art through exhibitions and museums, and most of the time they didn't receive money in exchange. They never attended the openings of the exhibition or exhibitions organized by Dubuffet in which their work was presented, and they were never asked about the way in which they wanted their work to be presented. So today, this history raises questions about cultural appropriation or artistic appropriation, which means a form of appropriation of the cultural or the art of the others, most of the time the cultural of a minority, without taking into account the fact that this minority is both socially dominated, vulnerable, and clearly impoverished, poor. So that's the reason why we can begin to imagine today different ways of repatriation, maybe, or restitution of these works to their historical contexts.
Thank you, Joana, for raising these very important questions. And this exhibition is very much an ongoing project that were opportunities for us curatorially to point out the voices of the patients and trying to also bring back their agency within the context of the exhibition itself through letters or other moments of personal identification or practices that were done on site, among them writings. We are now going to introduce Eduardo Gardi, who will present the last section of the exhibition, during which we looked at the legacy of Tosquelles in the context of the US mental health history, which is punctuated, you will see, of attempt to reshape the treatment of mental health, in addition to the very notion of mental health itself. The visitors will learn in that section that this history is comprised of clashing utopian and anti-utopian examples, sharing sometimes strong affinities with the Tosquelles' vision of an asylum village. Curatorially, we approach this section of the exhibition in a different way. We very much tried to pair artworks by creative individuals, sometimes created inside and others outside of the confine of the psychiatric institutions, and pair them with a defining moment of that history. Edward, I will ask you the first question. How are the very particular circumstances under which Tosquelles came to be known for his work at Saint-Alban related to our experience of shifting mental health paradigm in the United States today?
Yeah, thank you for this question, Valérie. I think the link is at the level of ideas somewhat direct, because we find this idea of asylum, which for Tosquelles, as you've heard, needed to be supplemented in a way with the idea of asylum village in order to really actualize it. This idea of asylum is already at play in the thought of the earliest the time period, the earliest mental health institutions, and even evident in some of the early asylum art. We have right here, you can see a work, An Antarctic Scenery by Richard Nisbet from 1816. That's the earliest of works we have in our show, which kind of depicts something like this early fantasy of kind of asylum and like finding a kind of safe haven amidst other unsafe havens, that not only was key to this thought that led to the development of asylums, but was itself mirrored in the larger political history of this country. Nisbet, it's a very interesting history to look into. I was ultimately a patient in the Pennsylvania State Hospital, but prior to this moment had been very involved in early debates about freedom and abolition of slavery. It's a very intricate history, but it's directly related to the development of the American Psychological Association. So it's quite profound in this sense. So a lot of people know the image of asylums as this kind of hulking, oppressive institution, and it is comes to be accurate at a certain point. But what I'd like to emphasize is that the really strange thing about it is that there was always kind of this idea of asylum, in a sense, very akin to Tosquelles, as a kind of shelter, or as Joana had said, from shelter from the violence of a society, and a haven against the kind of madness of society itself. You'll also see on this slide, along with the Nisbet, a drawing pretty early of the uncannily named St. Albans sanatorium that's down in Radford, Virginia. It was very much in its original ambition. It was like a privately funded institution that had a similar ideology to the Institut Perimata, where Tosquelles, as we've noted, did his training. and it was trying to mobilize like the use of open spaces and kind of creating a space outside of society where people could recover, find a kind of sanctuary. Now, the Saint-Alban Sanatorium is now mostly known today for being one of the more prominent haunted sites on the East Coast, because it became a kind of like haunted house attraction after it was disinvested from around the mid 20th century, and the asylum fell out of use. And that was itself after there was funding issues such that I think the government took over at a certain point, and then they weren't able to upkeep this. This in many ways mirrors the larger history of asylums. And if Valérie, you could send me to the next slide, please. Thank you. We see kind of then this most popular image of asylums in the US, which was something that Tosquelles was opposing internally, like working, running an asylum and running a psychiatric hospital. It's something that is common to some of the self-taught masters in our field in folk art or self-taught art. Martin Ramirez, of course, spent majority of his life in asylums in California. Actually, it's I think at least 4 artists in this section of the exhibition. Their lives follow the trajectory of having gone from immigrants to the United States to searching for work in a major city to then ending up committed to an asylum basically involuntarily, as the vast majority of cases were during this mid-century period. So you have then what becomes this oppressive asylum image, and in Ramirez's work, famously, you have all these tunnels and routes to escape various trains or vehicles, and even we could count a horse in this instance also as something that precipitates a line of flight. So this was a tendency that this was kind of the reality of where the asylum idea went, even though in the 19th century there were all these attempts, like by a figure named Dorothea Dix, who established 27, I think, state asylums across the US. It had favored initially this kind of open space model that was like the fundamentals of what Tosquelles trained under. You'll also see here on this slide an embroidery by Joseph Roth, who was a patient at the Willard State Hospital in upstate New York. His life follows a trajectory quite similar to that of Ramirez, insofar as he was an immigrant from Germany who ended up in New York City and got sent up to Willard eventually. But what I like as a contrast between these two works by artists, patient artists, and very similar structurally their circumstances, is that whereas in Ramirez we get this sort of desire for flight or even a kind of escape from these circumstances, and in Roth you get this very nice, like, sort of objective depiction of the asylum model itself, somehow this knowledge of that which is containing him, and so you really get a sense of perspective on the totality there, I think. So you see this shift in the history from how the openness of asylum as a sanctuary culminates in various forms of closure, I think.
Yeah,
would be my answer here.
Yeah, and talking about this perspective, how might we approach the perspectives within these artworks, their visual construction on the history of mental health and psychotherapeutic practice?
I think that's an interesting question, for the reason that whereas in those previous works that we just went through, you get perspective on the sort of bigger picture of where these artists are situated, what they're living under. But there's been a turn in more recent decades toward like perspective of the individual as like their position, like what are they feeling internally, what are their thoughts on this. And incidentally, it's not something that scholars and artists have had the ability to kind of approach so directly. I'm going to give 2 examples to demonstrate this point here. You'll see on this slide here in the bottom right, a suitcase. It belonged to a man named Lawrence Mocha, who was a patient also at the Willard State Hospital, where Roth was at as well. And he was like Ramirez and Roth. He had immigrated to this country from modern day Austria, was in New York City, and then had was reported to have various schizophrenic symptoms, went up to the Willard Asylum, where he, after a certain point, had even asked petition to leave, was denied this request, and he kind of lived out his days as the gravedigger of the asylum. Years go by, the Willard Asylum closes, and in 1995, when kind of going through whatever was left there, scholars and found dozens of suitcases in the attic of the asylum that had basically been untouched for several decades. In fact, Mocha had arrived in 1918, and this was opened in 95. So it shows that this was basically a time capsule. Mocha's is actually, like I said, one of dozens, but it's the only one that's been exhibited by us and first the New York State Museum, for the reason that it's the only one of the patient's families that had signed off on saying that it was okay to exhibit this. So Mocha here, not an artist, but we get something of an intimate perspective of what it was like to be a patient at an asylum, or at least like reopens the asylum history from the standpoint of the individual, and in a way that's very contingent. Likewise, you'll see this beautiful coat we have up here from an artist that is unidentified, but known as Merlin. She was, what we do know, and this is like with the Mocha, the case of Mocha, a lot of research went into even getting minimal details about these objects. What you see is that Merlin was 28 years old in 1948 when she was taken into the Eastern State Psychiatric Hospital. She too was reported to have had schizophrenic symptoms as the cause of being there, so to speak. But the treatments were often very cruel, brutal, and not particularly helpful for dealing with these symptoms. One bit of solace that she found was in sewing, and turned out to have a great proficiency in sewing, working with textiles and embroideries. Was known, this is through a lot of scholarship that pieces together, was known to pull together scraps of whatever she could find working throughout the asylum. And this here, the coat you see, is one of two pieces we know by her. The other is in an art center still in Tennessee, where she had lived. But we basically know about this work because in the 80s it was found in like the laundry or a storage room there. So again, these objects were not necessarily especially relevant in the case of something that I think is more directly an art object than the suitcase with Merlin's coat. They were seen as kind of embroideries or textiles, they not having the artistic value function like we were discussing with Dubuffet earlier. This was often the case with embroideries and sort of the mediums that were the province of women in the mid-century period. Interestingly, what scholars, a scholar named Catherine Hurd, among others, was able to piece together about Merlin is that Merlin was among probably the earliest Americans administered Thorazine, the first antipsychotic medication. And while it did make her symptoms better, she stopped sewing entirely in this time. So there's some very interesting relationship between this creativity and the struggles that were going on for the period that she was in this asylum. And she's also in this way embodies the larger history of asylum art or patient artists in the United States with these tendencies that we described, because the asylums after the advent of Thorazine pretty much were immediately disinvested from the move on a countrywide level was to say, we have these medications now, so nobody needs these places. And for decades, it was a matter of like, should the federal government pay for treatment for people, or is it the states, or then is it the individual families? And Valerie, I think this would be a good time maybe to go to the next slide. Thank you. And one of the more successful models that kind of happened was these collaborations with nonprofits working with people who had mental illnesses or other cognitive symptoms, creative growth on the West Coast, and then the Healing Arts Initiative here until 2016, Creedmoor. There is basically a more explicit move towards cultivating, using a kind of art therapeutic model that was driven again by nonprofit sector, and led to not only some really extraordinary art like the art of those working inside asylums, but the development of a very, I would say, articulate sense of individual style that was in part the product of cultivation by some workshop leaders in like the case of HAI. What's interesting then is that when we get this a very pronounced individual dimension, we get a kind of murkiness about how these come to have been on the art market. And now, kind of, you know, a couple decades removed from the advent of these workshops, it is the ethical standard that, of course, the artists own what they produce, any profits go to them, and so on. But this was developed as a result of real-time questions about what was to be done, the status of these art objects that were in a way the result of a therapy, but being put towards artistic ends. So this is interesting. And then I think a good supplement to this is somebody like Anthony Dominguez, whose work we have at the top here in the black and white, because Dominguez was basically off the grid and would work with resources he could find and work in the public library here in New York, the main branch. And I think this kind of attests to, in retrospect, if we went from Dominguez backwards, we could see sort of the almost like struggle for resources as like a pure political question in the production of art. That is because he was somewhat subtracted from these institutions. But I think even then we could go further and say, well, what is this question of like the ownership of an individual over their art relative to, say, Saint-Alban, something yet different, where when these works were, say, Forestiers were sold to Buffet or otherwise, Tosquelles' practice was that this money of the artworks, like anything else produced in this asylum village of Saint-Alban, went back into the collective ownership structure of the hospital. So in a way, we have a very clear, albeit open question of a bifurcation between political questions about resources and then the artistic value, or the degree to which like something really is an aesthetic phenomenon. So this is the way we kind of tried to approach a sense of perspective, where sometimes the individual fades in view of the larger structure, and then sometimes it's the other way around, where we get a really refined sense of who the individual is as an artist, but then we wonder about the genealogy of these works. So that's kind of how I would approach that question in tandem with the last one, Valerie.
Thank you, Eddie. So as we merge towards the final part of our program at the Q&A, I wanted to ask a question, and Mathilde, you are welcome to join us again. So I was thinking about our conversation we had earlier yesterday about the heritage and legacy of Tosquelles. And Joana, you point out that there's no main centralized archive center on Tosquelles, but rather dispersed polls and repositories. You talked about this exhibition to be itself an archive. Can you please elaborate on this point in regard to the various extensions of Tosquelles' legacy and influences on 20th century intellectual life, among them that we covered in the show, like Fanon, Henriette Laborde. You point out also an exhibition at the Palais de Tokyo in which they are referring to the Casablanca case that is similar to Laborde. You mentioned as well the Art and Cultural Center in development on the site of Saint-Alban that is still an operational psychiatric hospital in southern France, and your most recent book on Nouche. So if you want to say a few words about this legacy and this notion of an exhibition as an archive and being part of this larger spectrum of repositories on Tosquelles.
Yes, many thanks, Valérie. So the question of the Tosquelles legacy and archives, I think it's a very interesting one. when we began to work together with Carlas in 2017, the access to the different Tosquelles archives was very difficult, not only because the Tosquelles archives were sometimes lost or not centralized, and they were dispersed or disseminated in different countries and different institutions in Catalonia, in Spain, in France, in Belgium, or in Switzerland, but because we asked ourselves with Carlas the question of knowing what objects, what documents, what images, what letters, what works of art could constitute this lacking and disseminated archive. In a certain sense, we have ourselves elaborate or imagine or shape the Tosquelles archives within the exhibition, thanks to the exhibitions themselves, since at the end of the shows, all the materials will again be dispersed with no centralized archives. There are no Tosquelles archives in Catalonia, in France, or in Spain. So because ours is an ongoing research on Tosquelles, we can imagine soon to incorporate, as you say, Valérie, to other exhibitions in the future, other Tosquelles legacies, like the experience conducted by France Fanon in Algeria, in Blida, and the Dr. Ziu experience in Casablanca, in Morocco, with the new archives that we have not still found in a certain way. So the question of women also is a very important one. Not only the psychiatric women, but also the patients, as you say, Valérie. I think that the question of the voices of the patients and other testimonies which are not already gathered would be in the next future there in the new archive or in the new shows that we will present on Tosquelles.
Thank you, Joana. And Carles, you talked earlier about the complex stories of ownership among this legacy of Tosquelles as well. Do you have any other elements you would like to point out that refers to what we have included in the exhibition that reflect on this heritage, on this very dense heritage left by Tosquelles?
No, indeed, I subscribe all that Joana said, because we were confronted with this dramatic problem, which is how do you represent an intellectual psychiatric production and bring it back to the museum, which is the oddest thing you can imagine. And then, I mean, how do you flesh out this experience when it is related to an institution which often has been very opaque, closed in itself, and inaccessible to the public eye? So this is also about the story about an institution which has been consciously segregated from our public scrutiny. So something else is the fact that Tosquelles, I mean, I wouldn't like to mythologize or sort of, generate a sort of a myth out of this pragmatic hero like Tosquelles, but I think we have to really keep in mind that he belongs to a large network. He belongs to sort of a history of intellectual migrations on a world scale, large. So it is a complex history that challenges what museums can receive, present, and visualize, because as I was saying before, it invites us to see works by intellectuals like Paul Eluard, Jean Dubuffet next to the works of patients, plus many other unnamed figures who will be soon discovered within the context of Saint-Alban and many other places. So we have an strange, a very unlikely regime of coexistence of materials that, as Joana was saying, I mean, makes the temporary exhibition an ideal archive that has to be permanently revised and reconsidered.
Thank you. Mathilde, welcome back.
Yes, hi, and I'd like to thank you all for this really great tour of the exhibition and to also walking through this complex history and incredibly rich history. So thank you all. And maybe what I was struck when I entered the gallery is how alive you made this history, because you talked about that, this idea that you started with archives and an integral history and how you make that into an exhibition. I would love for you maybe to expand a little bit on that, and also how you collaborated together, Carlos and Joana, and then with AFAM, how also it took another form. So if you can talk more about this extraordinary work together as curators and as thinkers, how you mix these two together. I think we lost, did we lose Joana?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Maybe Carlos, you can start.
Yeah, I can go for that. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it is a lot. To make a long story short, I was impressed by the name of Tosquelles because I didn't know anything about this man back in 2011. Then there was an important work by Angela Melitopoulos and Maurizio Lazzaretto that in 2012 they recuperated a long interview with Tosquelles made in 1987. In that long interview, Tosquelles was referring to historical episodes that we didn't know anything about, that we were completely unaware. So I personally thought that we had to reconstitute the facts behind this story, and facts that were first known because Tosquelles was very much speaking in a very how to say, almost delusional way about his own life. So when Joanna and myself started to work together, which was around 2017, 2018, we undertook the mission to visit all these places, to talk to people, to reread a lot of text. So it was not just going to the shelf and pull out the book about institutional psychotherapy or about Tosquelles' life. There was no such a handbook. We had to really be prepared to grapple heterogeneous materials. Then, as Valérie was recalling, the first time I installed the exhibition in Toulouse, it was really a challenge because I was confronted with more than 700 objects, items, documents, films, testimonies, books that had never been together. And we had to really come up with a narrative with all that massive amounts of information. It is a narrative that is being refined over 4 exhibitions, 4 moments in connection also with the expectations of each particular institutions. Like, for example, in Toulouse, of course, we gave a lot of attention to the regional network of hospitals and the institutions that were committed to institutional psychotherapy throughout the 40s and the 50s, because we're speaking about Saint-Alban, but there were many other hospitals in one degree or another equally important in terms of contributing to reinventing our relationship with mental illness. Then when the exhibition went to Barcelona, of course, for us, it was the chance to recuperate, to restitute François Tosquelles and transform it into Francesc Tosquelles to recall the important innovations in the 30s in Catalonia before the Spanish Civil War. So it was a restitution, what had to be done at that point. Then in Madrid, of course, it was the necessity to reincorporate these experiences into the context of a national museum and to reintegrate it into the canon of a national narrative. Whereas here in New York, the beautiful challenge is the fact that institutional psychotherapy is not like French cheese. It's something that happened all over the world, and it is susceptible to be connected with the institutionalization process started in the 60s in the States through Irving Goffman or Thomas Szasz and the many other institutions. So it is an ongoing project.
Wonderful project, and with so many layers. And we will continue this conversation on May 2nd for the symposium. We're going to really talk about your research process and the different iterations, and we're really excited to have you back again. Then we have one question, and maybe we can take that question before we close the program. It's from Diane. She's asking, it was a moment where you were talking about Art Brut, so it's maybe for Valérie. Was this a romanticization of mental illness, and was it ever translated into ensuring the best treatment of those diagnosed as mentally ill? So maybe for Carles and and Valérie and Joana, if you want to answer this question about Art Brut.
I'm sure this is not to romanticize the work of patients that Dubuffet and entered this initiative of collecting objects created in mental institutions. He was looking at the works created outside of the art mainstream as a critique of the art institutions and the way that the fact that these works were pushed aside, art history, and were not properly preserved, conserved, and given a voice. And one thing that he was compelled to do before he collected works, he documented the works in the creative context in which these works were made in hospitals, but elsewhere. And what he did early on in his adventure of Art Brut was to publish essays and ask collaborators to publish essays on the works by these individuals. And he was seeking to have these articles to be a reference and basic articles on their artistic production. He liked to gather more than one works. He liked to have like ensembles. He liked to be he liked to invite writers and people who were close to these creators. In the case of Forestier, he sought the views of Dr. Uri, who was like one of his interns at Saint-Alban. So he was all the time seeking documentation and collateral documents to accompany the interpretation of the works. This is a more complicated answer, but I think this exhibition doesn't try to hide the various initiatives behind the collecting of works by mental patients from the early 20th century with the initiative of Hans Prinzhorn to other large-scale exhibition in the 50s, which gave rise to the term of psychopathological art, up to recent workshops like Creative Growth or Fountain House in New York, and who have been like working in concert with patients and their families to properly either take ownership or share these works with the public.
Thank you so much, Valérie. I don't know if anyone else wants to expand on that, or
I would maybe
sure.
like to
Please.
add just a footnote to what Valérie has said. For me, a very important question is when we speak, when we think about madness, are we speaking, are we talking, are we reflecting on ourselves, or are we talking about other people, the others? Because I do think that in the 20th century, we have movements, avant-garde movements like surrealism with people like Paul Éluard, André Breton, and other people. We have Dubuffet, Art Brut, we have psychopathological art, and so on. And I do think that these concepts or these avant-garde movements speak of madness as something coming from others, the others. That's the reason why women are that real, that present in that moment, because women are the others, the alterity. I do think that Tosquelles' work is not about the others. Madness is about we ourselves. So I do think that this is a main difference between these different and concurrent and not similar projects. Of course, these two different projects, madness as something that speaks of others and alterity, and madness as something that speaks about ourselves. Sometimes these two histories have encountered, like in Saint-Alban. That's interesting. That's what Valérie was saying about the complexity of this story. This is a complex history, but I do think that we as readers of the 20th century, we have to, to ask a political approach to madness. So it's about ours, it's just only the others of the culture. And that's for me a very key question.